Welcome to Podcasting Smarter, the podcast for podcasters by podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Hello and welcome to Podcasting Smarter. This is Norma Jean Belenke, Podbean's head of events. And in today's episode, we're having a conversation with Podbean's podcast specialist, Roni Gosch, on podcast discoverability. Stay tuned, and here we go. Hi, Roni. How's it going?
Going fantastic, Norma Jean. How's everything going for you?
Good. I'm so excited to talk about podcast discoverability today. And we'll get into a lot of it in a second. First off, what is podcast discoverability? But first, I just also want to share that this episode, we're going to go over the basics, but we're doing a summer series called the Summer of Discoverability. We're sharing how indie podcasters and brands can increase their discoverability. So first off, what is discoverability?
So when we talk about discoverability, what we're really talking about is how easy is it for your target audience to find your podcast? So when we talk about discoverability, it's kind of like the overall umbrella of like, okay, how good is your podcast? How good is your podcast SEO? How good is your promotion strategy? Are you finding the best avenue or the best platform for your podcast? Are you utilizing the tools of like creating an audience avatar to make sure that your podcast is properly targeted towards your ideal listener? So when it comes to discoverability, there's no like one facet to think about. Think about it as kind of like a wagon wheel, So it looks like it's one giant monolith, but there's like individual spokes that kind of hold everything up.
So Roni, why is podcast discoverability so important for podcasters?
So discoverability is how you are going to find new listeners for your podcast. We're going to be talking about this, throughout the rest of the summer. But when it comes to like your overall podcast growth, the two things that you're going to want to focus on are discoverability and retention. Retention is maintaining the audience that you have, making sure that they, stay and they continue to listen. But discoverability is how you achieve the growth of finding more listeners. So the focus there is to, expand your podcast reach, try to dive a bit deeper into the communities that you're a part of to make sure that your content is reaching the listeners that it's supposed to reach.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's a lot of things that go into discoverability. So let's break it down because there's really an opportunity to optimize things that you would think are really basic, but can make a huge difference, like your podcast titles, descriptions, and tags to improve discoverability. So how can podcasters really make the most of things that seem really basic in terms of setting your podcast up, but can help people find the show?
So the key thing to remember with everything involving your podcast, from the overall podcast title to the episode titles to, your description to even like, I think it goes down even as far as like the file name that you're utilizing for your podcast. The thing for all of these is keywords. Now, this is going to be something that is always, you have to grow with it, I suppose. That's not the right phrase. It's not something you're going to get right on the first time. So
yeah, absolutely. I think it's something where, as your show evolves and as, your audience finds you more and more, you may think that some keywords or some titles for episodes are really intuitive, but then actually you're going to want to maybe pose a question in your podcast title, in your podcast episode titles, or, in your show notes as well.
Yeah. Like, there's a balance between like having a fun, kitschy title that is, eye-catching, that's going to make people want to tune in, while also making sure that people know exactly what that episode is about. So you want to make sure that, with your episodes, with the descriptions, you're including things like keywords, because that's how people are going to find your podcast in something like a Google search or searching on a directory for a particular topic. So, and also bear in mind with all of these, they can always change. You can always go back and, adjust the wording on something. You can always go back and, change your podcast description to see if it might hit a bit different, depending on the keywords that you're using.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there any specific strategies or techniques podcasters can use to enhance their overall podcast discoverability?
So one of the first things I will say is that when you are, coming up with a title for an episode, Google the title first. Just, throw it in Google real quick and see what's coming up. If there's something that, matches it exactly, if there's some stuff that, kind of matches, but not, 100%. So you can see how well your podcast title would do as a Google search. So if you're utilizing the right keywords, if people are looking up those same keywords, your podcast title, the episode title is more likely to come up. But if you choose something a bit, niche, where it's not something people are going to really be looking for, if you try to, keep the jokes, but none of the keywords, it's going to be harder for people to find that particular episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And search is your friend, right? Google, whichever search engines you use, it's something where that's how podcasts are found a lot of the time. So it's something where, if people are looking for information on a specific topic or a specific expert, maybe you have that expert on your podcast, you've interviewed them, but search isn't scanning audio, right? So you want to make sure that you have specific indicators that are going to pull up that episode in search. So it is a really important aspect as well, because search engines play a role in podcast discoverability, but so do directories, Ronnie. So tell us a little bit about that as well.
So directories are almost going to be like search engines, but just for podcasts. So for example, if someone's really, passionate about Pokemon, and they can go to any podcast directory and just look up Pokemon, and they can see what podcasts are going to come up under that topic. The ones that are obviously going to come up first are the ones that have Pokemon like in the title of the podcast name. But any podcast that has, an episode about Pokemon that has, any kind of mention of Pokemon in the description is going to come up as well. So keep in mind when you are coming up with everything from your podcast name to, episode titles to the description of your podcast, what are people going to be looking for if the main goal is to find this particular episode or to find your particular podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just a couple things in terms of discoverability. There are a lot more tools and ideas that we have throughout our Summer of Discoverability series. And just really quickly, we can go over a couple of them, including guesting on other podcasts that have a similar audience or an audience that you want to tap into. That can mean, having the other podcaster on your podcast and then you guesting on their podcast. If you have an interview show, you can also do ad swaps. You can also do feed drops, which is where you release an episode of your show on someone else's feed and they do the same for you. Theoretically, if it's a direct swap. And usually that host would endorse the episode and say, hey, I really like this content. I think you'll like it too. And it's really a personal recommendation. So those are just a couple of things that you can do to increase your discoverability. And check out the Summer of Discoverability series. And of course, if you have any questions, reach out to us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Thanks, Ronnie.
Of course.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Podcasting Smarter. If you have any podcasting questions or want to get in touch, send us an email at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Thanks so much and happy podcasting.